All right, welcome back to the afternoon session of Monday of the Dabrowski Congress. Next up, thank you to our host, the Morgridge College of Education and the Daniel L. Ritchie Endowed Chair in Gifted Education, Norma Hafenstein. Thank you to Gifted Unlimited for sponsoring breakfast and some door prizes tomorrow. And next up, we have Eric Vorm from the U.S. Navy. Take it away, Eric.
All right, how's everyone doing today? Good. I have the privilege of being the after lunch talk, which is historically the most exciting talk because I got to wake you guys all up. So, hi, my name's Eric. I am in the U.S. Navy. I'm here to talk to you about something that'll take us a little far afield than where I think you've been today so far. But hopefully I'll be able to tie it into the topic and theme of this conference by the end. Bear with me. Before we get started, I do have to go through the obligatory legalese to say these viewpoints are my own. I do not represent the United States Navy, the United States Department of Defense, the United States Naval Research Laboratory. Please don't quote me. Don't assume anything that I'm saying today is an official stance on anything in the government. That out of the way. Really quickly, just a little bit about me, because I know a lot of you, but you don't know me, thanks to all the wonderful papers many of you have written. So as I mentioned, I'm an officer in the United States Navy. I've been in the Navy for 18 years now. I'm going to assume that I'm actually holding on to the transceiver, and that's why I keep getting recognized. So I've done a lot of different things in the Navy, but today I'm a cognitive systems engineer. So I have a doctorate in human-computer interaction. I work mostly with human-computer interaction stuff, human-machine teaming primarily. But en route to where I am today, I stopped by for a master's degree at University of North Texas in gifted and talented education. I studied under Ann Wren and Michael Saylor. Is that right? Hey, we share some common lineage. That's very nice. So I've never done anything with that professionally. I just don't really have the opportunity to express that part of myself and interests within the organization that I work. But I am here to share with you the first and only time in my 18 years of doing this job that something organically really came up. And I hope that you'll find it as interesting as I did. So without further ado, for those of you who are not really following what's going on in terms of geopolitical developments around the world, for the last 20 years, the United States military in general, or the government in general, has been prioritizing this war on terrorism. That's been our primary focus, this idea that we need to be ever vigilant against terrorists and their types. Recently, over in the last few years, we've essentially gone back to the same posture we had in the 1980s, which is now we're trying to prepare for a near peer competition, fighting against another very large country like China or Russia, who has equal or even better than numbers and technologies than we do. And this has a lot of people really on edge, and it's developing into quite a lot of changes within the government in general in terms of its priorities and strategies and things like that. One of the most important things about how do you develop a strategy to essentially to win the next war, it always revolves around technology. Whoever has the best tech will win the next war. That's basically the ideology. So we have a lot of focus on technology these days. And there's some of these technologies that are particularly troubling that really get our attention quite a bit. We generally just refer to these as emerging technologies. So there they are, you can read them. And I will say my slides are available. I'm gonna go through this first part, which is the sort of non-Dabrowski part, as quickly as I can so that I can get to the good stuff. So there's a lot of material that I just won't speak directly to. Please, I encourage you to read it. Ask me questions later whenever I have a chance. But these technologies here, like quantum, lethal autonomous weapon systems, biotechnology, they are sort of on the cusp of becoming real. And basically, if they do become real, they have a very significant likelihood of disrupting the balance of power in the world. And that's a big deal because we enjoy a certain status in the world and we have for a long time. So we're not eager to see that lost. So these emerging technologies really get a lot of people's attention. You have to think about emerging technologies as if, well, let's just put it in terms that you're probably more familiar with, like playing chess, right? Imagine you've been playing chess all your life. You know how to play chess. You know all the pieces. You know all the strategies. You know how to defeat your opponent because you think about how they're thinking. You anticipate their moves. Well, imagine if we just suddenly introduced a brand new chess piece. Everything changes, right? Now you have to rethink all of those same strategies, not only just for how am I going to use this new piece, instead of a rook and a castle and a bishop, now we have a jackal. Just making that. So what do you do with this new piece? It has new limitations, new possibilities, but you're not the only person to get that piece. Your adversary also gets it as well. So this sort of like duality here really forces a lot of concern as we approach, how do you come up with good strategy in terms of where do we put our resources, research and development money, priorities for future development, 10 or 20 years out. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So that's a generic term that we talk about in the military quite a bit called readiness. I think it's pretty much the same as the word access in the educational world. It's like the most important thing we talk about all the time. So readiness is sort of got its own little duality here. One is, of course, the more familiar one that you guys have heard of quite a bit, which is the ability that we can, pull up anchor and set sail within 24 hours of being attacked, like in Pearl Harbor, for instance. So the ability to fight tonight, the ability to defend ourselves around the world at any time, within a week, we can send whole divisions of people and machinery. And that's a certain type of readiness. But the capability side is more long-term focus. And that really starts conversations, not just about the technology, but what about the people? How do you prepare the people? Because no matter how good the tech is, if you got people who don't really know how to use it, or are not really talented enough to use it, or not really informed or educated enough to use it, you're not really going to help anything. In fact, you might make things worse. So that is the sort of introduction to how I got involved with this very interesting project. Essentially, the Navy's HR department, the third highest ranking admiral in the entire Navy, who's in charge of manpower, personnel training, and education policy. He has to report to Congress every year that says, this is how the Navy is spending its money to plan for the future. This office approached me and said, we want you to define for us, what does it mean to be intellectually ready for emerging technologies? Interesting. Okay, I have no background in this particular thing. I human machine teaming. I help build robots and stuff. But they came to me and said, this is what we want you to do. So I took it upon myself to embrace it and say, okay, let's see what we can do. So this is about the beginning of 2021, just to give you an idea. So the first step in any kind of action like this is to develop a model. What is intellectual readiness? What that really means is, what are its constituent parts, especially if you're going to be developing strategies and priorities, things that you could say train, you got to break it into something more meaningful. You can't just say intellectual readiness is blank. You got to be able to give it a little bit more detail. So to do this, I used a theory called grounded theory. Those of you who are not familiar with grounded theory, essentially, instead of starting with a hypothesis and then setting up experiments to test those hypotheses, grounded theory starts with collecting data and then tries to develop hypotheses from the data. In other words, we don't start with assumptions. We just say, oh, let's see what the data tells us. So I used this theory, developed a mixed method approach between running interviews with people that I'll tell you about in a second, and then validating that model using factor analysis. So I'm going to talk about these two things as quickly as I can without getting bogged down in the details again. I love to talk about methodology, but I'm not necessarily sure that you guys came here to learn about methodology. So I want to get to the Dabrowski stuff as soon as I can. So interviews. If I just went to active duty Navy sailors and said, what do you think intellectual readiness is? I'd get a very limited description. So I didn't want to do that. And it's worth noting that our country's actually been through an era like this before. In fact, the turn of the 20th century had a ton of emerging technologies that were just becoming real things, like aircraft, just becoming a real thing. And we knew that they were going to change the balance of power. We didn't know how we should use them. Should they only, in fact, for those history buffs here, early aviation was only used just for aerial reconnaissance, just taking pictures. It was only until one day, and in fact, during World War I, planes would fly and the enemy would pass by and they'd wave at each other. Because, you know, you've got a camera, I've got a camera, we know what we're doing. There's nothing evil about that. Until one day, a guy brought a rifle with him and shot at the other guy. And then suddenly, now we've got aerial combat. So that's a whole thing that nobody thought about for the first several years of aviation. Just a little example. So I went specifically to try to get perspectives from historians and authors who have written extensively about earlier eras where intellectual readiness played a role. I also went out of my way to speak to the people who are working in these emerging technologies directly. Quantum physicists, astrophysicists, people at Tesla, SpaceX, NASA, chief roboticist at NASA, and I spoke for 2 hours straight. Very, very, very interesting people. The people at the Quantum Institute, Washington, D.C. So I wanted to get a good breadth of perspective. This is just kind of a brief list to show you what I tried to do to get this perspective. So that when I say, what is intellectual readiness? I'm not just getting a single color, I'm getting a wide kaleidoscope of color. Okay. So good interviews start with a motivating scenario. You won't have enough time to read this because I'm going to move past it real fast, but basically it just describes some future 10, 15 years from now. And everybody is given the same scenario so that it sort of grounds everybody and says, this is where we're starting. So everybody starts from the same perspective. And following that, we ask the following introductory questions. What kinds of personality traits, characteristics, and cognitive abilities will sailors of tomorrow need to successfully operate in uncertain environments filled with complex technologies? What attributes or characteristics will be most valuable in a technocentric scenario described above? Answers to those questions start the interview, and we just go from there. So as you see, I got a pretty decent representation across all of the different domains that I was interested in hearing from. So I got a little bit of active duty folks, a little bit of government workers and scientists, and a little bit of civilian workers and scientists. 49 people total, took me 7 months to do, 114 hours of transcripts. That's a lot of listening to people talk. So here's where things start to get a little bit more related to Dabrowski. When you imagine the answers to this type of question, you're probably thinking they should be good at math. We should have more STEM education, right? These are pretty predictable. And we heard a lot of that as well. People should be familiar with computers because computers are going to be central to everything, even more in the future than they are today, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But some of the things that came up were just downright eerie. I think you'll see what I mean. So first of all, that slide is messed up. I don't know why that is. Okay. I think we can still muscle through. So first of all, on the left, people were very quick to start describing the Steve Jobs of the world. They said, you know, people who just think differently, they see things in a uniquely different way. I did not make this statement. This statement came from other people. People who ask what if more than ask what is. That sounds pretty familiar to this crowd, right? A person who sees connections between different ideas or things easily, makes connections that others don't typically make. Wow, this is uncanny. And again, over 7 months, this is just happening more and more and more. After about the third month, I said, you know, gotta be careful. I'm going to start crying if I'm not careful here. I got to be willing to sort of like let this secret part of me out, because it's impossible to listen to these people talk about innovators and creative people and not start to see things through the lens of Dabrowski. And it's about at that time that I said, you know, I got to find a conference to talk about this. So here I am. All right. But in addition to just talking about sort of these, you know, personality ideal of tomorrow's sailor, I also heard directly from a lot of these people, a remarkable amount of these people themselves on the right-hand side, if you could read that, were remarkably frustrated, talented individuals who are just feeling constrained. They work in an environment that says, I don't care if you can do more. This is what you're supposed to do. This is your job. Just do your job and shut up. Stop asking questions. Questions are seen as insubordination sometimes, or challenging authority. These are not ideal environments for gifted excuse me, I'm going to try not to use the word gifted whenever I can. Innovative and creative people. I'll explain why that is in a minute. So these people were remarkable to talk to because, again, they're out there on the front lines and they're not, walking around with a banner saying I'm gifted. They're just saying, I am frustrated. I'm irritated. I am in an environment that really, truly does not like me. And I'm just trying to make things better. And I found this to be absolutely fascinating. I'd like to give you at least one case study. I'll introduce you to Colin. Colin graduated from Stanford with a bachelor's in science in computer science, the top computer science program in the country in 2019, and immediately joined the Navy. To him, he said, I didn't really like the atmosphere of Silicon Valley, and I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. A lot of people join the military for this news. Being the motivated guy that he is, he immediately volunteered to try to become a Navy SEAL, the absolute hardest thing you can possibly do. It takes 2 full years of training, has a 98% attrition rate. And I'm not exaggerating. You can look up those numbers yourself. It's very, very, very high attrition. 6 months into training, Colin is learning how to land a rubber boat on a rocky beach in Coronado Bay under the cover of darkness. Very important for Navy SEALs to know how to do. And the surf tosses him up. He lands on the rocks, breaks his leg. Training's done. It's a mandatory 2-year wait before he can get back into that training again. In the meantime, the Navy, get to work kid, sends him out to a ship. He's on a destroyer now, based out of Japan. And I talked to him via satellite phone where he's floating around in the South China Sea. Now, Colin's job on the ship is the assistant damage controlman. Essentially, he's the fire marshal. His job entails such challenging thing as checking all of the fire extinguishers every day, checking all of the smoke alarms every day, making sure the manuals are published and available at every station around the ship every day. And that's it. And that's his job. That's literally his job. So Colin's quite bored. He's quite miserable. He's floating around far away from his family, far away from anything, forget about intellectually satisfying. He notices a situation on the ship. One of the radars that we have ingests tremendous amounts of data. It literally is like a Hoover vacuum, which soaks up data from the environment. Terabytes of data every hour. And that data doesn't go anywhere. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ship, we have a different type of radar system that gives you very, very, very rudimentary information, not very useful at all. Doesn't really help you. And these two things don't talk to each other. Colin says, hey, why can't we plug this data stream into a neural network, which would train this radar? And now you have this integrated system that would truly open up your eyes and ears to the environment around you. That's a non-starter. Chain of command says, go color in the corner, do your job, shut up, stop asking questions. So Colin proceeds to write a 32-page proposal on his own and then starts doing Google Scholar searches until he finds my boss. And he just cold calls my boss or sends him an email with this proposal out of nowhere. I work in the Laboratory for Autonomous Systems Research. I have 34 PhDs that work under me are all experts in machine learning. My boss brings me this report. I take it to all the people in our meeting, and they say, this is indistinguishable from anything that any of us would have written. You knew that was coming. So Colin's a very sad guy. He's a miserable guy. He's floating around, again, far away from home, far away from family, far away from anything personally satisfying, any intellectual efforts at all. Just writing that report was essentially his lifeline. So sure, he was happy to talk to me, but he had a lot of really sad things to say, as you can see. Now, he's a very confident guy. I could literally rewrite this code in Python over the weekend if I was just given permission to do that. But of course, one of those radar systems belongs to Lockheed Martin. One of them belongs to Honeywell. Contracts say you can't touch those things. They don't talk to each other. And that's just basically how it goes. You don't just get to go and fiddle with stuff in the military. Most people just give up. They just say, just get on with it. We just have to live with what we have to live. Basically, why do you keep trying to change things? Why do you keep trying to make things better? Just shut up and get back to work. And he asks some very difficult questions, such as, why do I persist when it just gets me in trouble? Why can't I just conform? He was a very, very, very sad guy. It was difficult for me to talk to him on a satellite phone for an hour very fuzzy reception. Of course, I didn't want to, reach out and give them a hug and tell them that there's some hope out there. What I ended up telling is saying, I'm going to talk to you or talk about you with a bunch of strangers in Denver. Okay, so the end result of this model development is this 12-factor model here. At the end of these slides and backups are the descriptions of each of these traits, so you can read about them individually as you wish. But I think you'll find some, pretty familiar terms here. Intellectual curiosity, a person's overall just need to know, insatiable drive to understand things, anticipatory thinking, the ability to think well beyond the near horizon and plan out, see connections between things, hard transfer learning, the ability to take learning from one domain and apply it to a completely different domain that's typically unrelated at all. And then, of course, there's even one called cognitive asynchrony. Interesting. I did not make these up. These came out of this model, grounded theory, not me. Okay, and I just point out, like, to use like another term from TBD, like that's what we were doing is essentially describing a collective personality idea. Just find that kind of humorous. So the next step in our process here, we can't just develop a model and say, here you go, maybe this is what it is. So says I, got to validate this model. Validation, if you're not familiar, basically, how well does this model fit with reality? Most of the time when we're validating models, we're saying, how well does this model hold up against the data? In our case, we say, how well does this model hold up in the eyes of our stakeholders? So we go to the same types of people, not the same people, but the same, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and we ask their opinions to rank in priority all of these traits. And we look to see where's the agreement, where's the disagreement, where's the tension. Some of these traits may just get booted out because they just don't load high enough statistically. That's what model validation is. So I used a factor analysis with a technique known as Q methodology. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very interesting methodology developed by a guy named William Stevenson. He's a student of Pearson in the early 20th century. It's known as the scientific study of subjectivity. So it really excels at giving you a mathematically rigorous way of evaluating people's opinions or their priorities in a way that gets around the trappings of Likert surveys. And I'll talk all afternoon about that to anyone who wants to talk methodology after a minute, but I'm not going to get wrapped up. The way we do this is take each of those traits, we make 3 descriptive statements for each one, making a bank of 36 statements total. And then instead of asking, for instance, a survey, if you were to say, what on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most important, rank your mother. And the next question, say, rank your country. And the next question, say, rank your children, right? What are you going to end up with? All 5s. And how meaningful is that data? Well, it turns out everything is important to everyone. Yeah. So this kind of gets around that because there can only be one most important. This is a forced choice matrix. Every single thing has to be considered in relation to everything else, which is a Gestalt approach, which is something I personally really appreciate. So that's the method. That's how it's done. Talk to me afterward. I'll tell you lots about it. My participants here, I got 100 more people to do this. Pretty even spread of education, as you see here, between high school all the way up to PhD. And again, roughly 1/3 active duty folks, government, and civilian. So really trying hard to get representative samples wherever I can. Of those 100 people, 81 people loaded high enough to be included in our analysis. Not familiar with factor analysis, essentially, it gives you a statistical way of grouping people together based on their shared common variance. In this case, it means you guys had almost exactly the same opinions, and you guys over here had different but same opinions amongst this group. And what that gives us now is, in this case, I have 3 different groups, and I can analyze each of those 3 groups independently, and then I can look at them and say, where's the tension, where's the agreement, disagreement? It's a very multi-layered, to use another term, multi-layered way of looking mathematically at how does our data stack up. So I put together this is just a composite sort, which basically is the average of everybody's arrangements of cards. And it's probably too hard for you to read it. So I'll just kind of get to the point, which is we expected to see like things like metacognition be ranked pretty high. Far transfer was ranked very high. Intellectual curiosity actually stayed up pretty high. I thought it might fall pretty low. But if you look just for those of you who are statistically minded, the -1 to 1 is our mean, because this is a standard distribution. The standard deviation is 2.5. So we look at basically the tails on either side, and that's where we really get the most information. So we see cognitive asynchrony pretty low. Computational literacy also pretty low. The importance of computers and being able to program and use computers, important, but not as important as these other things. And again, that's basically what our populations is telling us, is this is the priorities as we see it. So this starts to kind of give you some introduction to what I found the most interesting about this data. And I'll leave this to you. These are just the breakdowns and tables that you can see where the agreements and disagreements are. I pulled these out because I felt like these are the things that are kind of most related to the giftedness concept: intellectual curiosity, far transfer learning, anticipatory thinking, cognitive thinking. And what we basically see, to kind of give you a summary here, is there's not a disconnect, there is a tension. Organizations talk frequently about the need for innovative and creative people. But if you look at their policies and the way that they do business, it's actually very discouraging to those people. In most ways, that actually prevents those people from being innovative. This is nothing new to you, right? And so we see that actually mirrored in this data here. When we're doing the model development phase, people were very eager to talk about people like Steve Jobs. They wanted to talk about the Mavericks and the rebels. And they want to, evoke all of those personality characteristics that come along with being a very innovative and creative person. But when asked to rank, order, and priority with all things considered, we see that they all fell really low. And what's most interesting to that is we ask the question, why did you rank this as the highest and this is the lowest of every single person? And you can maybe read, but I'll just get to the point. The reason why all of these traits were ranked a lot lower than you might think is not because they're not important, but in this case, they're interpreted as being detrimental to teamwork. And teamwork, especially in the military, but any organization, we don't work independently. We all have to work along in teams. And some of the trait characteristics that are described here kind of suggest a loner, an independent person, maybe kind of a person that's really hard to deal with. And so that's kind of the tension that we see here. And I see this in two different ways. And I'd like to talk, this is how I can kind of bring this into where Dabrowski actually has a lot to say about this. Well, first of all, Dabrowski does talk about teamwork a couple of times. Just thought I'd throw this in here just for giggles. So teamwork is important for sure, but that's not the end all be all. And really, what does it mean? Why is my slides all messed up? I don't know. But what that really relates to Dabrowski's theory, I appreciate your sticking with me through the first half of this. But again, we see tension. We see tension in the messaging that corporations often have. We need more innovators. We even try to train people to be innovative. But then we actively suppress the characteristics and the nature of the people who might not fit the mold. And that's kind of unfortunate. So the organization itself has some incongruity there that should be addressed, but also the incongruity exists within the person. A lot of people take the words of Dabrowski and other types of theories and say, I just need to be fully myself. But there's a balance to be had there. We live in an organized, culture where we have to work together in teams. We're in a society. We don't see cave paintings with just one person hunting, right? We see groups of people hunting in cave paintings. We don't find like single person dwellings in Mesopotamia. We see cities and dwellings that have lots and lots and lots of people. So learning how to manage oneself is not quite as easy as you might think. As you guys probably all know. So I think Dabrowski actually has something to offer. And I'd like to suggest it in the form of 2 books that someone should write. And I'll introduce those in just a second. So when you ask me, where does Dabrowski's theory really shine? These are the 3 things that really make it truly unique. And we got lots of developmental theories out there, and they're all wonderful in various ways. But Dabrowski gives us very useful vocabulary, reframes mental health in a very, very, very unique way, and describes the essence of creative and innovative people in a way that has nothing to do with talents or abilities or scores or things like that, at least in most cases. And I think these 3 things have tremendous value to addressing these incongruities in these different following ways. So if I were to write 2 books about this, first one I would call How to Manage Misfits. And for those of you who can't really see, this is a young lady in a very beautiful pantsuit, executive pantsuit, but she's got tattoos and earrings and dreadlocks. And if you look at the way the business world teaches how to manage creative people, it's remarkably superficial. This is the actual model that they teach at Harvard Business School. This is the essence of creativity. Creativity is thought to be a mixture of a person's expertise, their cognitive style, which is essentially attitudes, and their motivation. Motivation is broken down into extrinsic and intrinsic. Managers are essentially taught if you can address all 3 of these things, you can increase creativity. And so, of course, what do you do? Well, how do you increase a person's motivation? Well, you dangle a bigger carrot, or you end up doing the equivalent of what some teachers who don't really understand giftedness in classrooms do, is say, hey, Billy, here's 10 more worksheets because I know you like to be challenged. And so you end up with the adult equivalent of that, which is, hey, Eric, I've got this new project for you because I like to, you like to be challenged. Gee, thanks. Not quite exactly, what really gets my motivation going. And it's not about me. I don't mean to use myself here. Anyway, management practices are pretty superficial, and this is about as good as it gets. Again, this is Harvard Business School. As I've pointed out, the results of this study really highlight the tension that many organizations have with their interviewers. And I kind of term that like a love-hate relationship. But attracting and retaining top talent is the absolute #1 priority of all businesses. So addressing these incongruities is actually like a major priority for them. And if you look, again, we have a lot of mixed messages going on. Say, be creative, follow orders, and it's hard. People are stuck in the middle trying to figure out, how do I navigate and how do I assert myself? How do I even try to make changes, even changes like trying to make the company better, trying to make the processes we have better in a way that doesn't get myself fired or isolated, and things like that. So management techniques really don't teach how to deal with creative and innovative people, or the word giftedness. And again, it's a very superficial thing. And I think guidance for managing creatives is an underserved market that Dabrowski gives us some very useful things. How can it help? Well, for the organizational focus, again, I mentioned the vocabulary. No one in my sphere of influence would tolerate the word gifted adults. That is an absolute end game. Just no more conversation if we bring that up. But they'll talk all day long about things like developmental potential. Absolutely. Over-excite abilities even. Sure, that sounds great. Let's talk about it. Easy stuff. Even things like third factor. Absolutely. It's a much more socially acceptable terminology. And I don't mean any disrespect to anyone who likes the term gifted adult, but I have to work in a very pragmatic environment, and I have to choose my words carefully. And I think Sheila? I think her talk earlier actually kind of highlights this. Why has the big 5 suddenly sort of eclipsed over-excitabilities? But guess what? It's kind of socially acceptable. It gives us a language that doesn't really offend anyone. A lot of the language that we tend to use kind of can be offensive to some people, whether you agree with it or not. It's just a practical thing that we have to live with. Dabrowski kind of helps us to sidestep a lot of that. So a book written for people how to manage creative people could actually be very, very, very informed by theory of positive disintegration. And I think that's one example of how I would address this type of incongruity. There's an opportunity there if somebody wants to take it. The other way is a book I would title How to Survive in an Organization That Hates You. I have needed this book for a really long time in my own life. So this again, I'll go back. You want to take a picture of the book? That's fine. No worries. I just to be clear, I have not read or written this book. I just played with Photoshop and made this thing. That's all. Dabrowski's theory often focuses specifically on the individual's development, and it talks about sort of their development within themselves. And external conflicts are often kind of limited to a broader culture or society, but we don't often talk about the organization as a context, or even as an opportunity or a catalyst for development. And I think this is an underserved opportunity as well. If you look at Dabrowski's theory, the factors that influence development are thought to be heredity, which is a person's genes, their developmental potential, which is the thing we talk about all the time, and the environment. And the environment's sort of just this kind of thing that we talk about in very little amounts. And it's thought to be sort of the environment's role is in direct proportion to a person's developmental potential. So if a person has really high developmental potential, the environment is just not that important. Conversely, for people who have maybe less developmental potential, maybe the environment plays a larger role. That's basically the theory. So the role of emotions, as we all know, is central to this theory as well. And I'd like to assert frustration is a pretty damn strong emotion. And you're in an organization that really basically sends you mixed messages all the time. You're pretty frustrated. I see a tremendous opportunity for this theory to be applied to a person and their development within the context of how do I get by and continue to make a living without burning bridges and butting heads with everyone. Interestingly enough, because I talked to a lot of historians, I was really surprised by this. The Steve Jobs of the world actually don't change very much. The Mavericks are popular stories that we like to tell, but historians assert, based on historical fact, the majority of innovations happen within the system, people working within the bureaucracy, not just going out and burning the building down and doing their own thing. So people who learn how to navigate bureaucracy, people who utilize their networks and their resources and their allies, people who intelligently dissent and intelligently rebel, that's how innovation actually happens. And you got to learn how to do that. Right? Just being your authentic self in the wrong manner can be an eccentric, difficult to work with person. And that's not what we want. That's not helpful at all. So you really want to make change within an organization, you got to learn these skills. And again, Dabrowski offers us some very useful things there. The conundrum that we're probably all familiar with is this sort of like fight or assimilate. So I'm within an organization, especially if you've been with that organization for some time, you're sort of vested, you've got to make a living, you've got to put food on the table. I can either butt heads with leadership, I can continue to burn bridges, keep fighting the good fight, and eventually burn myself out. Or what's the alternative? Well, I can put on a mask and pretend, oh, yes, sir, absolutely. And basically be a very inauthentic self and do the equivalent of what children in classrooms often do. And that basically leads to the adult equivalent of underachievement. The point I'd like to make here, both outcomes lead to organizations with less creative and innovative people. So it's bad for everyone. There's an opportunity here. Another thing I'd like to point out is I've always thought of Dabrowski's theory as being unique in this particular way. We don't necessarily see it as a mountain to climb, although Piechowski has famously, in a couple of his writings talked about it in that way. But if you really look at all of the stages, all of the levels, if you're successful, you essentially end up right where you started. Reintegration. This is a very powerful thought because a lot of folks who are stuck in difficult, frustrating environments are essentially wandering nomads looking for the sort of ideal utopian society filled with geniuses just like me. And that place doesn't exist, except maybe University of Denver. Dabrowski, again, gives us sort of an opportunity to see these struggles as a purpose where you can develop within the organization. And you can wind up thriving within that very organization that you're currently struggling with. And I think that's a very powerful thing to talk to people about. So how can TPD help? Again, one of the things it does is it reframes mental health. When you talk to people like Colin, boy, that guy just needs something to say, it's okay. This is actually not a bad thing. But he feels like the only person on the ship who's experiencing what he's experiencing. He probably is. There's 210 people on the destroyer. Statistically speaking, he might be the other one of those time. Viktor Frankl, famous for saying, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning. And Nietzsche was famous for saying, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Dabrowski gives us this meaning and this purpose to why you're going through these struggles. So the coaches out here have a really tremendous opportunity to talk about personal development, but not just for its own sake, but the practical applications of how can you actually make a living and work within a corporation. Because most of us don't have the opportunity to sort of go off to some utopian society and work in that organization either. And lastly, I would say that, the theory of positive disintegration doesn't show you how to get to where you want to go. It doesn't even show you where that is. Yeah, I always think of it, it's more as like, here's a map and here's a compass. And I'll basically teach you how to use a map and a compass. So now you can use a map and a compass to figure out where you are. That helps. And then it's up to you to figure out where you want to go. This is a very, very, very powerful idea. Again, how can I thrive within this organization? How can I become the realistic, honest to goodness, authentic self, but also still be a meaningful team member and affect change and innovate within my organization? That's something nobody's talking about. I have not seen any books whatsoever about this. Where I do see Dabrowski's theory quite often is, developmental theory or counseling or the education in the classroom. I think there's an opportunity to sort of break into this new market. I think this theory specifically has a really tremendous applicability as a framework to both help organizations learn a more nuanced way of understanding their innovators, people understand how to work within their needs. So wrapping things up, you want to innovate, you better understand your innovators beyond just the sort of intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. They have a lot of incongruities right now. That's something that can be addressed. There's 3 really fantastic benefits that you're all familiar with. TPD has a fantastic opportunity to provide us tools, practical tools, to help both organizations and individuals. I think these are underserved markets. And I think it could introduce the theory of positive disintegration to a much wider market than where it currently enjoys its influence. So with that, I will stop talking and take any questions. Thank you very much. I will start with Linda because I saw her first. Yes, ma'am. I will be here tomorrow. Great. I look forward to reading more. Okay, you're next.
Are terrified often of folks who come up with ideas from seemingly nothing. And I feel that in an organization, you're dealing a lot with that.
So how do I personally deal with it? Or how would I? Do you write grants by any chance? No? Okay, that's fine. Grant writing kind of has to address that because I can put this same exact slide deck together 5 or 6 different ways and tell a different narrative in different ways. Introducing new ideas, if done incorrectly, can be very threatening. It's the status quo. You're shaking up what I already know. Again, the chessboard. Hey, I've been spending my whole entire life learning what these pieces can do. Now you're trying to give me a new piece. So you got to know how to introduce that. And that actually takes a lot of understanding what are the priorities of the organization? How does that organization work? So what I really like to talk about a lot, it's not just how do I manage myself, my own emotions, things like that, but I also have to get some emotional intelligence about the organization, the people I'm working with, it's bureaucracy, politics, these things all play a role in how do you thrive within any organization, but especially organizations that are vertical hierarchies with really predefined roles. So unless you happen to be in the perfect role for just like you're probably going to have to kind of learn how to, give and take. So hand over here, I think. Yes,
I find your work pretty fascinating, Eric. I wonder if you could give us a little more of a demographic on the 81, male, female, non-binary, race, ethnicity.
Yeah, I have it all. The full report, all 88 pages of it, is currently going through legal review. So it'll be fully unclassified and available to the public, probably hopefully by the end of this week. So you're more than welcome to just go to my website. It'll be hosted there as soon as I'm allowed to share it. I probably have like a copy of the report here on my phone, so I'm happy to share it with you afterward, talk all about that. And that's actually really important. When you do factor analysis, the real like meat and potatoes, I've only just shown you essentially the equivalent of the average, but the real meat and potatoes come out when you start to associate what does this group look like? And you start looking at demographics and you start to infer their attitudes and their opinions and as they relate to how long have they been on the job and how old are they and what's the demographics and variety of things like that. So factor analysis is that's really what you do most of it. I just didn't have time to do all that stuff today because it's not a methodology conference. Okay.
All right. A comment from the chat. Bill Tillier is happy to help co-author if you need help later. And I'll ask a question around, you did a lot of work around the factor analysis of the people, the individuals. Has your work shifted anything at the organizational level? Was anyone like, oh, maybe we should change something? Or
Absolutely. The entire United States Navy listens to me every day. So in reality, this was submitted exactly 2 weeks ago. So, I mean, I just literally finished it. It's undergoing, the official legal review that allows us to share it. So the program officer and all of the people at the highest level, highest echelon are basically reading it right now. The process will look something like this, and I don't mean to be too cynical, but, oh yeah, that's a really big report. You read that. Okay, sure, I'll read through it. And then somebody will try to summarize it in some way, even though I wrote a pretty good executive summary. And then they'll essentially say, all right, how do these recommendations jive with what we're already thinking of doing? And at some level, some watered down version of some of my recommendations may actually get selected. And they may come up with like a new training protocol, or they might come back to me and say, you develop the training, at which point I'll say, I don't know how to do that, and I'll look to somebody else. But it's too early to see. And when you do this type of job, and especially you work in this type of environment, you got to play the long game. It's not one report that's going to make any kind of difference. It's this type of report repeated over and over and over again in the language that will not rub them the wrong way and make them shut me down. And that's another kind of lesson that any of us need to learn. If you want to get them to pay attention to you, you got to kind of like understand the language. So I hope maybe by next year, I'll have something to say, hey, look at these changes. They're amazing.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. When you were talking about very strict hierarchy of organizations, how do you think this could apply across other organizations like higher ed? Do you think that that could be an implication eventually,
Absolutely.
even to crack higher ed?
Absolutely. Well, I'm assuming you mean by higher ed, you mean like the roles that the teacher has versus the administrators and who can do what?
Like faculty, administration, chair, dean, right? Like how hierarchical it is.
Yeah.
I just left a position.
Yep.
Just because I could not be creative. I couldn't do any work. It was
Story of
very
my life.
frustrating.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So how can we affect big vertical hierarchies? Well, I don't think there's any one answer. One of the answers is somebody should write that book that I mocked up. Somebody. But again, I think the way that you make any kind of changes to this is you have to assert in an intelligent way, hey, we can expand these roles. Or some organizations are a little bit more willing to actually abandon those types of roles and have these more like fluid roles. Just depends on the organization, right? Yeah, a little bit flatter structure, exactly. Some organizations are, it's kind of gaining more popularity these days. I think COVID actually assisted us in this way because everyone working from home sort of don't have like the corner office anymore and all of that kind of stuff. So there's no one answer to this, but I can at least reassert one of the ways that you can make that change is to be sort of the internal, I don't want to use a spy, but you got to be like an internal, like you got to be on the good side. You got to be someone who's trying to make changes, but is seen as an ally, not as someone who seems consistently as just a pain in the butt. We can talk all afternoon. I'll be here all night long. Well, eventually I want to go to bed. Anyone else?
What happened to Colin?
That's a good question. I sent him the report 2 weeks ago. Legally, there wasn't released yet. That's not on the record, right? Anyway, he's still floating around. He put in a request officially to come off of the ship and come work where I work at the United States Naval Research Laboratory. That was promptly denied. Because in order for him to come off that ship, that would gap his billet, which is really important, by the way, assistant damage controlman. We need people to check our fire extinguishers. And there's nobody to like immediately replace Colin. So he's so important, they can't move him. And that's, again, that's the kind of conundrum. He is so important. If you put him in the right place, he could change the way that our radar systems work. I'm not being hyperbolic here, but the reality is it's not who you are and what you might do. An organization like this sees what the role you're in, and that's it. So you get a code attached to your record, and that's who you are, not anything more holistically than that. And it's not just the military. I'm not here to bash the military in any way. I've served for 18 years and they've been good to me. My entire education has been paid for 100% by the United States government. Came in with a bachelor's degree. I got a master's and a PhD paid for by the government. So I don't mean to suggest it's just the military, but any large corporation. You work at Google, you find the same exact thing. Any other questions?
I have one more in the chat, and if I think we might have time for one more from the audience too. So thank you. That was brain handy to hear this being discussed. I'm wondering about the delicate place between encouraging individuality and being part of a team, especially in military environments where tight teamwork is essential to staying alive. Without that tight structure in many systems, they would collapse. How do we find that balance to maintaining systems while encouraging the creativity and individual thinking and strengths?
Fantastic question. So I'm very happy to report that the military has actually made a lot of progress in this particular way. When I joined the military in 2004, we were still under don't ask, don't tell, which is a policy. Basically, you can be gay as long as you don't tell anyone about it. And if we find you out, you're out. So it was basically stay in the closet and shut up. And I was an ally to a great many people during that time. Just happened to attract gay people. I don't know why. But I knew dozens of people, and I was with the Marine Corps infantry on the ground in Iraq. The hardest, toughest, roughest people you'd ever meet. But they were soft inside. And when Don't Ask, Don't Tell went away, there was no like gay pride parade in the military. Just the next day, just everyone comes to work, everyone's doing the same thing. One by one, they just sort of find a way to share, like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm gay. And all the rest of the people in the unit was kidding. Like, I had no idea. That was just totally like unsurprising or totally surprising, excuse me. And their answer, I think, was really important to hear, which was to say, most of them would just say, well, it's just part of who I am. It's not like the only part of who I am. It's not like I have to run around saying, hey, everyone, look at me. I'm being my authentic self now. It's just a part of who you are. So there's a way to find that balance without being, I would say, overindulgent. And I think that's really where the spectrum should be drawn. Your full authenticity can sometimes turn into eccentricity or overindulgence, and that really runs afoul of pretty much our Western culture, which is we all need to get along. It's not necessarily the tall poppy syndrome, but it's a little bit of that as well. So learning how to do that comes from both the organization and the individual. And again, I'm happy to report the military in general has made great strides to sort of embrace diversity, enhance the way that we can talk about things. So you actually see quite a lot of really like open people these days. We still have to wear our haircut according to regulations. You have to wear a uniform. You can't wear like a gay pride pin on your uniform. That's just not allowed. But you see these people out in town on the weekend and they look very different, and they're perfectly fine and they're perfectly accepted, and they're able to thrive in some ways within that environment. Unfortunately, I guess I can say unfortunately in this case, it's a little easier to be LGBTQ than it is to be gifted. It's just kind of the reality right now. Maybe that won't be the reality for very long. Let's be positive. Anything else, Joy?
We'll do one more from the chat and we'll keep it quick. How did you learn about Dabrowski's theory?
So Norma, you kind of hijacked me this morning and I couldn't answer this question earlier. I'm going to do my best to do this today, but sure. My final deployment to Iraq was in 2009. I was a very, very, very miserable individual. At my actual end of my own rope, just didn't have anything left to give. And was searching for meaning anywhere I could find it. Random Google search brought up something about gifted stuff. I read through a list, I think on the Hoagie's website or NAGC or one of those places. One of the first articles was Linda Silverman. And you saved my life, Linda. So that's how I learned about Dabrowski. Thank you for introducing it to me. And with that, I'm out.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was great.